Wow! Hey everybody, bit of a quick book review for you all. So this book was 1984 and I heartily recommend it for anybody interested in nuclear war and the topic of the Cold War. Dense, packed with scientific information. Actually got two of the research projects in here. Lots of information, very, very fascinating. So the impetus to write this came from a 1983 article, which is linked. So check that one out if you want to have a look at this as well. So Carl Sagan was one of 5 authors who principally put together a paper on the effects of nuclear war, looking at atmospheric and biological issues. And because of their article, it was about 50 people got involved in this. In fact, more got involved in this. They had a big conference, and this has actually got conference questions in it from people who met there. And they actually even, quite remarkably in 1984, they actually got a few of the Russian scientists to take part in the conference via the magic of satellite, I guess. So until about 1983, Russians and Americans firmly believed they could fight a strategic nuclear war and parts of the world, most of the world, would actually be okay. And that obviously affects planning. What this book came up with, and it's not exactly currently true. So what this group came up with was that not only would a nuclear war be devastating, both to humanity and civilization, but in all probability would actually cause the extinction of humanity. And they figured even small exchanges, as long as it involved sufficient cities and sufficient fire, would do this via the nuclear winter. And I don't know about you, but I've often thought about the nuclear winter, and it to me seemed to be like a really bad winter, right? But went on for a few months. Well, there's some interesting stuff in this, so stay tuned and maybe learn something. So the estimate of a population of about 4 billion, 1.1 billion could potentially die from the direct effects of a strategic nuclear war between Russia and the United States. So in current terms that would be around about 2.5 billion, maybe slightly higher, because humanity is quite strongly urbanized since 1984. There are lots of charts and diagrams, and you probably won't see this as well as you want to, but this is kind of fun. It shows you what the effects would be and where, looking at the two combatants, and that's always interesting. And part of this presentation will actually be looking at the other side, the red side. So what they're talking about is about 1,000 missiles hitting about 1,000 cities to trigger a nuclear winter. Now there's a lot of variables in there, but it's quite stunning just how cold and severe this nuclear winter would be. Took me a bit by surprise. So it's the actual effects of the burning cities and oil supplies and forests from the direct effects of nuclear warfare that would cause a large amount of smoke and other material to go into the upper atmosphere, which would block sunlight. And this would trigger a global temperature drop. It would spread to the southern hemisphere in a matter of a few weeks to a month. And they would have a drop in temperature, not as great as a drop in temperature in the northern hemisphere, but bad enough to really cause them severe issues trying to stay alive. Now the two main arguments against this at the time was volcanic activity. They pointed out volcanic activity, actually most of the injector doesn't go into the upper atmosphere, it actually goes to the ground, and it's different particle size. So they kind of explain why that doesn't happen. The other argument was that if it doesn't take this large amount of nuclear weapons going off, how comes all the weapons tested which exceeded their threshold hadn't triggered a nuclear winter previously? And they explained this fairly reasonably, I thought, was that the atomic explosions were over a prolonged period of time, not over a few days. And also the atomic weapon tests were actually specifically designed not to go off over cities or over major forests that would burn. Most of them were tested under the ground or over the ground, deserts or very, very isolated tropical islands. Now they estimate the cities will burn for weeks to months, or a month or two after the explosion. So the amount of smoke going into the atmosphere would continue to increase. Now this is their worst case, which is probably unlikely to ever happen now. And you'll see the graphs on the number of nuclear weaponry. But that's the temperature drops they expected to happen, with a very, very large explosive force aiming at cities mainly. 2 months after the nuclear war, where I am in the mid-latitudes of the northern hemisphere, we would be seeing temperature drops of minus 43 centigrade from baseline, or 45 Fahrenheit from baseline. What this basically means is, whoa, that's really, really cold. Because if it happens in July, it's going to be like minus 25 centigrade here for up to 4 months after the nuclear war. But if it's winter, it's going to be minus 50 to minus 60 here for that period of time, and so on and so forth throughout the globe. And as you point out, the tropical plants and the plants of the southern hemisphere are much less likely to be able to survive any sort of a temperature drop in this range or close to this range. Now, interestingly, up to a year after the nuclear war in the northern hemisphere, temperatures will be globally minus 3 centigrade on average down, which is like a mini ice age. I think the real shocker for me was just how dark it would get. When I were at Hiroshima, the complete darkness at midday freaked me out. This year really freaks me out. The northern hemisphere sunlight intensity is proportion of normal. 1.5 months afterwards, where I am in the mid-latitudes, 0.01 of normal. Pitch black. 8 months later, it'd be 50% of normal. So this is obviously you can have major cold, you can have major sunlight loss, you can have major growing issues. You can write off the first year afterwards. What they point out is the prolonged cold and toxins from plastics burning, which would now be a lot worse, may well make the second season unlikely. So the burning of the plastics and the toxins that we would release from a major explosion over multiple urban centres in the current world in 2019 would cause way more toxicity of the soil, the air and the water than we'd expect to see. So we're not going to have nuclear winter for 20 years, we're not. By the 20th year period, climate change will have continued and we will be back above baseline. In fact, climate change may be a little worse because of the loss of carbon and the loss of carbon sequestering from oceanic life and plant life. So we could be in a lot of problems even 20 years after this because of the reduction in blocking effect from industrial civilization, but the increased carbon dioxide and nitrous oxide and sulfides in the atmosphere. So it would be very, very hot 20 years after the nuclear war. So almost any reduction in sunlight in the Amazon and places like that in the tropical forests actually stops plant growth. They're actually at full capacity as it is. The northern latitudes, we can lose about 20% of our sunlight and our plants can still marginally grow. What we're looking at is a 5% loss of light months and months after a nuclear war. Then possibly 50%. Now this is where it gets kind of arguable because new facts and figures have come in. What we're looking at now is not so much a nuclear winter, but they think a nuclear fall. But that's best case scenario, and it depends on how many places are hit and with how many weapons. One of the interesting things for me is that all of these nuclear winter effects, because of the smoke and the burning, are made much, much worse when you switch to lower kiloton weapons apart from megaton weapons. So actually it's less likely if you have the same megatonnage dropping, if it drops in less bombs. So as we all know, our weaponry has gone into multiple smaller kiloton weaponry, so we've actually made this problem worse for ourselves. I think it's an interesting thing. No, it's not survivable for the human race. The biologists in this, Enright and the rest of them, pretty much sum up the effects with the nuclear winter, with the toxicity, with the solid freezing, with the loss of most of the oceanic life in the upper surface of the oceans. Human beings, if they live at all, would be in small scattered communities, probably more likely on islands that are very, very remote in the southern hemisphere. But the human numbers that will survive and the distance and possibility from each other would mean. So the human gene pool, also severely impacted by radiation and malnutrition and everything else, it's unlikely humanity would survive. It's unlikely most large mammals, a bit bigger than rats, would survive. So it's frankly amazing to me when 1984 rolled around, I did not expect to be alive in the year 2000 directly because of nuclear war. We'd had the Berlin blockade, we'd had the Korean War, we'd had Cuba, and we had the invasion of Afghanistan. And that was just the actual aggressive acts that could have led to an all-out nuclear war. Well, many accidents that were prevented from starting a nuclear war, so it's lucky we did it. And then at the end of all of this, Ronald Reagan, a true American hero, actually realized, along with Gorbachev, his Russian counterpart, that fighting a strategic nuclear war, or even probably a tactical one, would eradicate humanity. So they really depleted the stockpiles of nuclear weapons, trying to get rid of them. And that was the goal, to actually get to a point in place where nuclear weapons, we wouldn't have enough to annihilate humanity by a nuclear winter, but we'd have more than enough to stop anybody bullying us, because let's face it, they do a lot of damage. So now, of course, we're rapidly getting into a new Cold War. And I said I was going to be optimistic, and I'm going to be optimistic. I think we can convince our leaders not to fight a nuclear war. I think we can convince our leaders, despite what some of them say, that we can in fact not threaten to use weaponry and be very careful about using those types of weaponry, for the very reason we have more than enough. India and Pakistan alone have more than enough, if they target cities, which they probably would in that region, to actually trigger a minor nuclear winter, which would be devastating for the southern hemisphere and the northern hemisphere. It doesn't take much temperature reduction to really mess up the ability of wheat and rice to grow. And this brings us into something else they brought out here, which I didn't really think about. The coasts are going to be warmer than the interior of continents. I'm going to be really cold here, where I am. So if you live in Nova Scotia, it won't be quite so cold. You know, you might get a 5 or 10 centigrade degree drop, right? So that's okay. Well, it isn't okay. The oceans retain the heat. The land, the soil, loses it real fast. What you'll have, because of convection effects between the two surfaces and the suddenness of this drop, you'll have massive megastorms on all the coastal areas and all the islands. So the chance of actually surviving on an island is going to be really limited because of these convection currents. Now obviously the more remote the island is, the more likely you are to survive. The other thing I didn't realise was participation. The effects, I'm not going to go into it, book goes into it, participation for about a year after a nuclear war of this severity will be reduced throughout the entire planet. So there's not even going to be much water coming down to wash the radiation away. And the radiation levels that we're going to experience are, as I pointed out in my other thing, probably well enough to sterilize all the males and females that we have alive as human beings. Human beings being the most sensitive creature to radiation. So for about a month to 6 months after an all-out nuclear war, all the fresh water in the northern hemisphere will freeze to a depth of 1 meter to 1.5 meters. Call it 2 yards. That actually impacts my personal prepping quite a bit. I'm seriously considering now getting a manual icebreaker that they use for ice fishing, because it may not work to rely on my well with temperatures that extreme and that low for that long. And there will be very little rain falling, and what falls may well be very radioactive in the first phase. I'm going to store more water at the bug out location as well, specifically for this reason. Water is also very good at blocking gamma radiation, so it's actually a good thing to put around the walls and ceiling of your bug out location. It's barrels of water. Good thing to have. I hope you enjoyed that. So the message is yes, we have the ability to actually exterminate ourselves. Guaranteed. And I think we don't need to grope around in the dark and be cold. I think we can actually look at the light and we can be warmer. We don't need to fight other human beings just because of border territorial disputes. We have to really take this on board. We have to wear the seatbelt all the time. We cannot take it for granted that a nuclear war will never happen. There's never been a weapon developed that has never been used. Nuclear weapons already been used. Just ask the Japanese. So hopefully we've got the smartness not to go back to there. And on a personal level, it's really, really sad. I honestly felt after 1990 that this was a threat that was gone. And it isn't. It's still there. It's still very, very much there. So remember, in SHTF, tomorrow will always be worse than today unless you prepare.
Times are getting hard, boys. Money's getting scarce. If times don't get no better, boys, gonna leave this place.
But what they came up with is that even a small nuclear war between two small people, like Becky,
I was 5 and he was 6. We rode on horses made of sticks. He wore black and I wore white.